Look, when Peter Dutton became the new leader of the Liberal Party, the critics were out in force. He lacked charisma. He wouldn't be able to relate to people outside Queensland. Well, I'll tell you something. It's in our own interests to start listening to what Dutton is saying about this critical and potentially economically destructive issue of the 43% emissions reduction target by 2030, about to be enshrined in law. The Energy Minister, Bowen, is now running around in circles trying to reach his target of 82% of electricity to come from renewable sources in fewer than 8 years. When do we describe this as self-sabotage? When we are a raw materials powerhouse and therefore should be a cheap energy powerhouse, instead of bending the knee to Paris and the United Nations, who have no interest whatever in our economic well-being. I have repeated over and over again the words of Maurice Strong, the discredited godfather of climate change, who said in 1992, that's how long this nonsense has been going on, and I quote, "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisation to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?" 1992. When do we wake up? Christine Stewart, the former Canadian Minister for the Environment, said, quote, "No matter if the science of global warming is all phony, climate change provides the greatest opportunity to bring about equality and justice in the world," unquote. Christina Figueres of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change said in February 2014 in Brussels, quote, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, changing the economic development model that's been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution," unquote. Ottmar Edenhofer is a German economist, regarded as one of the world's leading experts on climate change policy. He said of the Climate Change Summit in 2010, the 2010 version of last year's Glasgow, quote, "Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separate from major themes of globalisation. The Climate Summit in Cancun," this was 2010 in Mexico, "the Climate Summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War." He said, "One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. This is about wealth transformation," unquote. Look, I guarantee Paris to peanuts that people like Albanese and Bowen, the lot of them, have never read anything by Edenhofer or Figueres. Yet embark on this policy of self-sabotage, and to support them, endless emotional speeches, protests, yes, media editorials, and the big woke corporates fall into line. A UN-sponsored redistribution of wealth is the climate change agenda. China's got no intention of shutting down its coal-fired power stations and replacing them with weak, intermittent wind and solar. They want energy security, and through it, national wealth, and through that, military power. Energy is the lifeblood of every nation. China is leaving the West for dead. Peter Dutton enters the fray by rightly saying that by legislating emission targets, radical activists will be able to use the courts to seek legal interpretation of what the statute means in order to shut down everything from cattle farms to road upgrades on the basis of climate change. Dutton has said, quote, "The experience overseas has shown that legislating emissions targets hands control over major infrastructure projects to green activists," unquote. In the face of opposition by the bedwetters in the opposition, people like Simon Birmingham, the coalition did not support the Bowen legislation. Peter Dutton warned that once emission targets become law, legal and local activists will follow the example set by the environmentalists overseas to try to stop the government from financing or supporting a range of critical projects. Indeed, the Albanese government has already mentioned outfits like Infrastructure Australia and Export Finance Australia, which by law will have to take emissions targets into account. And so, get ready for an all-out attack on gas drilling, beef processing, the building of roads and ports. Do they meet legislated emissions targets? Well, it's already started. Clive Palmer has a coal-fired power station project in central Queensland. For the first time ever in this country, a federal government has proposed to reject such a project. The Queensland Labor government recommended rejection last year. And what does the Greens leader Adam Bandt had to say? I quote, "This is one down, 113 to go. There are 114 of these projects in the pipeline," unquote. Palmer is talking about the only proposal in Australia for a low-emissions coal-fired power station. High efficiency, low emissions, which would be supplied with coal by Palmer's nearby Galilee Basin coal mine. It would be carbon neutral, or carbon dioxide neutral, and achieve net zero emissions. Indeed, Palmer's company has committed to buying carbon offsets and developing carbon capture and storage technology. The power plant would be built on a cattle property near Alpha, 440 kilometres west of Rockhampton in central Queensland. And Palmer's company Waratah Coal says it will need 545 workers during construction and 90 to operate the power station. None of that counts. The company has correctly said the project is consistent with the government's renewable energy and emissions reduction targets and would further reduce emissions by replacing older and less efficient power stations. But the Labor government wants the support of the Greens in the Senate. The sun will come up in the west before a high-efficiency, low-emissions, coal-fired power station is built in this country under a Labor government. The reason Mr Albanese says he won't ban coal and gas exploration is that he wants the export income, but he won't allow Australians to take advantage of our own resources. Dutton is right. He must keep his nerve and prosecute the case over and over and over again. This legislation is taking Australia into a litigious world and a world of energy poverty. China will plough on regardless and will be happy to build our solar panels and wind turbines and then happily reflect on the mugs that we are.